particular church found that there was no preacher coming that Sunday because the preacher had forgotten to come, then they'd have one of their deacons, one of their leaders, read a sermon by Spurgeon or Moody. So deeply influential figures in those terms, I think.
And both of them obviously didn't make it into the 20th century. Both of them passed away, but their influences continued on in some capacity even to today. And you said that there was this shift between the separation where you saw the fundamentalists and the liberals start to split apart. In the United States, specifically in North America, we see it at Andover Newton, Yale, Harvard, this theology that is permeating. And then you see a response, a counter response, where those conservatives pull out of those liberal institutions and form their own, pulling out of Princeton to form Westminster, and then other schools like Moody Bible Institute and Wheaton College, NIAC, all of those schools that have been formulating. And you see, though, that controversy even continues on in some form into the mid-20th century. But we've always had this idea of liberalism retooling and becoming. There's always that split apart between conservatives and the liberal aspect of things. You see that even to today with this idea of what some have called progressive Christianity. How is progressive Christianity related or connected to the liberal Christianity that was making its way into the late 19th century and now is showing up into the 21st century? Are there connection points?
Yes, I'm sure there are. I don't think one should see contemporary progressive Christianity as a single entity. I think there are lots of positions. Some people within a progressive pattern are much more orthodox and others are much less orthodox. And by orthodox, I would apply criteria from the early church as well as criteria from traditional evangelical teaching. However, when that's been said, there are some features of the theology of the late 19th century that was incoming and liberal in tendency, and some of the features of contemporary thinking in progressive evangelical circles that are liberal in tendency too. One that I would single out, I think, is the notion of God as Father and Father alone. Now, clearly the scriptures do teach us that God is our Father, but there's a great deal in the Bible which speaks of God in very different terms. And one of them would be as king, one of them would be as judge, many of them would relate to his rulership, his government, and rather more austere and less automatically kindly qualities than are summed up by God as Father. And I think some progressive Christians of our day follow the tendencies of the late 19th century in seeing God as Father alone. That was one of the concerns that followers of Spurgeon had in the late 19th century. It was also a central concern at Andover. You mentioned Andover in particular in the States. There was a shift from the traditional New England theology, which went all the way back to Jonathan Edwards in the 1860s and 1870s at Andover, when people repudiated that tradition, which had reigned there at a time when Andover was the largest congregational seminary in the United States. And it was replaced by an emphasis on God as Father. Now, if you take God as Father alone, there are also all sorts of domino effects. If God is Father alone, then what do you make of the atonement? Surely a father would not make his son suffer. Surely, therefore, the atonement in its traditional form can't be accepted because we can't say that God imposes the burden of sins of the world on his son. That just doesn't seem to make sense. And there was a strong tendency in that direction. If God is, however, a God of justice as well as love, then he can be expected to want to pursue redemption, and that must be by extreme methods, and the extreme methods may involve the giving up of his son to death, and the son whose will is in harmony with that of the father may be willing to suffer death. So if God is not just Father but other things too, then the atonement in a more traditional form, a more redeeming form, one may think, can be validated. I do believe that quite a lot of the tendencies in contemporary progressive Christianity are associated with saying God is nothing but Father. He's always loved us. He will continue to love us. Therefore, one can wink at sin. Therefore, one doesn't need an atonement. And therefore, key elements in the traditional evangelical understanding of the scriptures are denuded of some of their value. Now, when that's been said, I think that there needs to be a very important caveat about seeing continuity between 19th century liberalism and 21st century progressivism. There are other major cultural influences in play now. Not just the legacy of the Enlightenment, which is still with us in large measure, not just the legacy of the Romantic movement, which is still in play, but also in the late 20th century, there's been the impact on society at large, Christianity in particular, and evangelicals most particularly, of a movement which has all sorts of labels, sometimes called modernism, springing from the early 20th century, but that's not theological modernism, that is cultural modernism. It's the assumptions of the avant-garde artists at the start of the 20th century, that one should express oneself culturally, so that, for example, non-representational art in the manner of Picasso enters into the cultural mainstream at the start of the 20th century. Now, that sort of expressivism, which is the way I prefer to call it now, because people were thought to need to express themselves culturally, became more and more widespread as the 20th century went on. And I think in the late 20th century, the need to express oneself impinged in a big way on the evangelical movement. One of its most obvious ways of expressing itself is through the charismatic renewal movement from the 1960s, which did say, yes, you must express yourself. That's why hands began to be raised in worship. That's why people started saying, I can dispense with the traditions of the elders in the evangelical movement. For example, I don't have to restrict myself by being an adherent to the temperance movement. I can drink alcohol. There's nothing in the Bible which condemns it. Jesus did. So there are all sorts of shifts from the 60s onwards, that crucial decade in the history of religion in the Western world, whereby these new cultural influences associated with expressivism came into force. And I would see myself postmodernism as an intellectual construct, which is an expression of expressivism. I would see that as the intellectual content of associated with the whole expressivist trend in culture. If that's true, one should expect certain aspects of expressivism to have had an impact on progressive Christianity in the recent past. And I think that's true. So that, for example, a willingness to let people express themselves in terms of their gender identity according to their preference is a natural corollary of that view which I've labeled by that word, expressivism. And I think progressive Christians in our day tend to be associated with the movement in favor of letting people express their gender identity exactly as they wish. And that, of course, is a major dividing force within Christianity in our day. In the States, it is actually dividing Methodism as we speak. The Methodist Church is undergoing schism, so that the United Methodist Church will lose half its congregations in Texas within a 12-month period. And there are similar developments, especially within the Church of England in the 21st century. And though that movement, that tendency is not limited to non-evangelicals, it affects evangelicals too. So I would see, yes, continuity with the late 19th century in progressive tendencies, but also innovations. And I would largely associate these with a fresh cultural wave. The past that's been inhabited by evangelicals can best be understood, it seems to me, in terms of successive waves of Enlightenment, Romanticism, and Expressivism. when you put them together and see how they mingle and interweave and are still influential in the present, you have a key to understanding how evangelicalism has changed over time.